Welcome back to another episode in the year of Final Fantasy during the month of Siren. Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite video games ever, Final Fantasy Adventure. I've already talked about this on my top 10 Game Boy RPG list, so I'll link that somewhere here. So the short version is that Final Fantasy Adventure was one of the few RPGs to see the light of day on the Game Boy. That being said, it was a textbook case of quality over quantity. Final Fantasy Adventure is a rare phenomenon in gaming history. Why? Because Final Fantasy Adventure really isn't considered a proper Final Fantasy game in this day and age. In fact, there's some incredibly strange things that are going on with this game, the Game Boy Final Fantasies in general, and how it relates to current Final Fantasy, and there's actually another spin-off series that we'll talk about that's kind of related. So let's go ahead and dive right in. When this game was released back in 1991, it was known as Seiken Densetsu Final Fantasy Gaiden. Remember that name. Essentially, this was one of the first spin-off Final Fantasy games, the word Gaiden itself meaning side story. The game has most of the trappings that you would expect in a Final Fantasy game, like chocobos and a high fantasy kind of medieval style world with very compelling story actually for a Game Boy game, and the music was fantastic. In fact, it's some of the best music even to this day. But what it didn't have was a turn-based battle system. Final Fantasy Adventure employed a top-down view that was like Legend of Zelda, especially combat-wise. It's a clear case that they were trying to jump on the bandwagon due to how popular Zelda was and of course still is today. The game has great graphics for being a Game Boy game, and it's just an all-around great adventure. Before we dive deeper into the strangeness of this game's legacy, I cannot skip over what's an extremely important story with my experience with this game. There is one puzzle that stumped me for literally years. I didn't figure out the puzzle until the very late 90s when I had access to the internet and GameFAQs came around, but keep in mind I had had this game since launch in 1991, maybe a little bit after 92. I won't spoil the answer to the puzzle here, but all I will tell you is that what stumped me was palm trees and 8. So getting back to what is really interesting with this game is that it's actually the first game to a little known series that you might have heard of called the Mana series. You know, that obscure game called Secret of Mana on the SNES that nobody really knows about? Yeah, it's one of the first of that franchise. In fact, it did kick off that franchise. So you may see why today people don't really classify this game as a true Final Fantasy game because it's part of the Mana series. It was the first game in the Mana series. But the argument can be made that the Mana series itself is a branch of Final Fantasy, just due to this game. I won't go into any other of the Mana series games during this Final Fantasy project, but it's definitely worth mentioning. So it being part of the Mana series, yeah, that's interesting, but there's also another couple of things that make this game pretty interesting, and that it has actually two distinctly different remakes. One was called the Sword of Mana that came out on the Game Boy Advance. At that time, the entire game was completely remade from the graphics and the combat system and everything, and it fit the kind of storybook aesthetic that the Mana games were going for and had made themselves known for back then. That remake was absolutely amazing. I love it. In fact, I love all the remakes of this game, but it's just completely wildly different than the game that I'm talking about today. So like I said, it doesn't stop there. To my surprise, I had stumbled upon the fact that there exists a game for the PS Vita and mobile devices known as Adventures of Mana, which is actually another remake of the game, but it's not a remake of the Sword of Mana game, it's a remake of Final Fantasy Adventure. This game actually doesn't use that crazy art style that Sword of Mana used. It kind of uses a upgraded 3D version of the original game, and the game feels more like the original Game Boy game, and what's really cool is you can actually even play the original music from the Game Boy game on this game. In this Adventures of Mana remake, the weird thing is that not only have they added in Final Fantasy jobs to the leveling system and thus kind of reintegrated it into its Final Fantasy roots, Sword of Mana actually pushed the game further away from the Final Fantasy roots because it entailed that storybook aesthetic and the Mana series kind of tropes that the games are known for. So it's really different how they've gone away from the Final Fantasy series and then kind of pulled it back. So if you're completely confused right now, you are in good company. However, I've played all three of the versions and they're basically all fantastic. I mean, you could not go wrong with the original game. Sword of Mana game or the Adventures of Mana, and in fact that's the only mobile game to date that I will recommend people get. It's pretty cheap, it's about $7 as of this recording, and it's definitely worth it. One last thing before we move on, remember I told you to remember that Final Fantasy Gaiden name? Well, if you go and look for that on the internet, you're actually going to bring up a game that we've already talked about called Final Fantasy and the Four Heroes of Light. Originally in Japan, that held the title of Hikari no Four Senshi Final Fantasy Gaiden. So technically it's the second Final Fantasy Gaiden game, but isn't actually related to the first Final Fantasy Gaiden, but it did start its own successful spin-off known as the Bravely series, which Square maintains has no connection to the proper Final Fantasy, despite it being exactly what you would expect an old Final Fantasy to be, but built with today's standard, which calls into question what a Final Fantasy game is, because a lot of people don't picture Final Fantasy as being a adventure action combat game, but Bravely Default is more Final Fantasy than a current Final Fantasy game is Final Fantasy 15. Alright, it's incredibly confusing, but it's really interesting with this Final Fantasy adventure, the steps that Square started to take, taking the series in an all new different direction. Regardless, Sword of Mana, Final Fantasy Adventure, Adventures of Mana, all of those games are all the same game, and you should play all of them. They are absolutely awesome. Next time on A Year of Final Fantasy, we're going to be heading back into the music realm with the hit spin-off series, Theater Rhythm Final Fantasy. So until next time, Crystal Warriors, keep on gaming.